Okay, Tov. So yesterday we talked about when is the correct time for a person to conduct the mishteh and the festive meal of Purim, and we explained that certainly the best practice is to do it in the morning, as early as possible after one has done the mitzvot of Purim. But really, one can do it the entire day. But it's best not to leave it all the way till the end of the day and do it in the late afternoon, rather to begin in the early afternoon after mincha. Now, the question arises with regards to this year when it falls on a Friday, and of course, we have our Seudah Shabbat on Friday night. So, the Gemara tells us in Gittin that it's forbidden to have a big meal on Erev Shabbat, which one isn't accustomed to the rest of the year. Any time on Friday, any kind of meal which is a large meal, which one doesn't usually have on a weekday, is forbidden to conduct on Friday. And the Gemara actually writes very severely and strongly against people who used to have this practice. And different reasons are given in the Haronim why this is the case. One reason is because it detracts from the kavod of Shabbat. One is having a huge meal on Friday. Another reason given is because people can't prepare adequately for Shabbat because they're busy engaging in this big Seudah on Friday. And so this is codified in the Rambam and the Shulchan Aruch, and it's forbidden to do so. However, this does not apply when there is a mitzvah bo bayom, a mitzvah which falls on that day. So classical examples are Brit Milah. If a Brit Milah falls on a Friday morning, then it is permissible for a person to have irregular Seudah and Mishteh because of the mitzvah which has fallen on that day. And the same applies to Purim. Because Purim, the Seudah falls on the day on Friday, it's permissible to have a large Seudah, larger than a person would normally have during the rest of the year, even though it's Erev Shabbat. And this can, strictly speaking, be done the entire day. Mi'ikar Hadin, one is allowed to have a large Seudat Purim the entire day on Friday. And so, strictly speaking, it would be permissible for a person to begin his Seudah in the afternoon and have a large Seudah with meat and wine, and then have another Seudah on Friday night for Shabbat. However, even the Ramah, who yesterday told us that that their custom was to do it in the afternoon, writes that when it falls on a Friday, one should do it in the morning. And the later poskim explain this to be that preferably before midday. Some understand this to be even until a few hours before sunset. The Maharil wrote up till 3 hours before sunset. And so what we're finding here is that aside from what we've discussed yesterday, it's always good to do it in the morning, is that specifically on a Friday, when Purim falls on a Friday, then it's certainly better to do it in the morning, at the very least before Chatzot, and before midday, and at the very least before a few hours before Shabbat, so early afternoon as opposed to late afternoon, because then one goes into Shabbat with a full stomach and isn't able to enjoy the Friday night meal as one adequately should do. And so, arguably, it would be the best practice that after a person finishes the Megillah and the Mishnah Manot, one sits down to have their Seudah sometime before midday this coming Friday. However, there is another concept in the Talmud, and this is recorded in the Rambam and the Shulchan Aruch called Pores Mapa Umekadesh, which means if a person is, for whatever reason, this is nothing to do with Purim, just generally speaking, is having a meal on Friday afternoon, a regular meal on Friday afternoon, which is permissible to do, and it continues into Shabbat. He didn't have a chance to finish it before Shabbat came in, and he was eating and having wine. Then halakha is one doesn't need to stop and say Birkat Hamazon and then begin again. One can just cover the bread for the Shabbat meal and does Kiddush. And Kiddush here will consist not of Borei Priya Gefen. On Friday night we say Borei Priya Gefen and Baruch Atah Hashem Mekadesh Shabbat. It won't be Borei Priya Gefen because you've already began drinking in the meal. And so, therefore, another option one has this Friday is that one can begin the meal in late afternoon, technically speaking, for Purim, wash for bread, have some meat, have a glass of wine, say Borei Pregef, and have a glass of wine. Obviously, you prayed Mincha before the Seudah, and you sit down to Seudah, have your bread, you wash, Nitzat Daim Hamotzi, have your wine, Borei Pregef, and then when the time for Shabbat comes, i.e. after sunset, one then covers over the bread, says the Kiddush on a glass glass of wine, and Yom HaShishi Vaychlu Hashem Haaretz, regular Kiddush of Friday night, but skipping out Borei Pri HaGefen, because you've already said Borei Pri HaGefen, therefore there's no need to say it again. So one would say the whole Kiddush, but skips out the blessing of Borei Pri HaGefen. One continues the meal, has some more bread, at least a kazait of bread, preferably a kabitza of bread, has some bread, and then says Birkat Hamazon. And in Birkat Hamazon, one would say Ritzeh v'halitzenu for Shabbat, and it's an argument whether one says Al Hanisim or not. It's, without going too much into the details, there are practices either way, and therefore whatever one does really is fine. Although generally speaking, I would say the Sfaradim would say it's better to leave out Al Hanisim. We find actually that the Meiri, Rabbi Menachem Meiri from the 1300s, from the south of France, writes that this was his custom, that when Purim fell on a Friday, they would begin the Seudah in the late afternoon, they would have Purim Seudah, and then they would obviously pray Mincha first, have Purim Seudah, then when Shabbat came in, they would cover the bread, say Kiddush, skip out Borei Pri HaGefen. There's no need to say Hamotzi again because you've already said Hamotzi, and you have some more bread, and then you say Birkat Hamazon. And that was, and according to the Meiri, one would also say Al Hanisim on Friday night because it's a continuation of the Seudah of Purim. And so that's certainly an option, and there are places which are doing that this year, and that's acceptable. It's certainly fine, although others argue that that's not in the first practice. And therefore, if one really wants to do everything correctly, and one wants to be able to have a Seudah in the late afternoon, then one has the option of perhaps washing in the morning, having a quick Seudah in the morning with some bread and some meat and a glass of wine, and then doing it in the afternoon, a proper big one, and continuing into Friday night. So really, in conclusion, there is no set practice with regards to this when it falls on a Friday. I would say that the best conduct is to do it in the morning, and have one's main Seudah then, although one doesn't have to do it then, and it's acceptable if a person does it any time in the morning, even in the early afternoon, and even if one doesn't get around to doing it, one can begin in the late afternoon, begin a Seudah for Purim, have some bread, some meat and some wine, and then do Kiddush, and then continue have some more bread for Shabbat, and then say Birkat Hamazon for Shabbat and for Purim. I hope that makes sense. And those are the different options for the Seudah of Purim this year.